My name is Claire Solomon. I was the president of the University of London Union in 2010, the year that students in the UK rose up against our governments. Did you all see us protesting over here? Yes? Good. It was a magnificent time. It was a very difficult time for us all, and I'm sure things like that have happened here in Georgia, and if not, then I'm sure they will do soon. The student uprisings in Britain weren't as big as those, for example, in Canada, and we didn't succeed in stopping the fees, but what we did succeed in is producing a new generation prepared to take on our governments and fight against what they are doing to us. I'm just going to talk briefly about the connection then between imperialism and austerity, between resistance and consciousness. After the student protests in Britain, I was asked by Verso publishers to pull together a book which we called Springtime, The New Student Rebellions, which was a collection of stories, both editorial, reports, photos, tweet walls, Facebook messages, and all sorts, both from UK, but also Greece, California, Tunisia, Egypt. Now, of course, it can only ever be a snapshot of what was going on. Indeed, a week later, a week after it being printed, the revolution in Egypt began. So, you know, you can never cover all of it, but we did have some excellent articles in there from Egypt. I want to just start with one little snippet from the book, from a chapter from Tunisia, and I hope this translates into Georgian. The chapter was called "He Who Cultivates Thorns Will Reap Wounds." Does this translate? Excellent, because this comes from a poem entitled "To the Tyrants of the World." It was a poem written in the early 1900s by a Tunisian poet during the French occupation of Tunisia. It is now also a song and a music video produced in 2002 during the Second Intifada, Palestinian Intifada, and dedicated to Ariel Sharon and George W. Bush. I think that really encapsulates the connections there between imperialism and austerity, because what we saw in Tunisia was the beginning of a revolutionary process. When Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, he did so in protest at the rising vegetable prices. This was an effect of the neoliberal restructuring of the economy in Tunisia. The prices of everything were going up. There was mass unemployment. Something like 28% of youth and students were unemployed. Education was about to be privatized, and just hundreds of thousands of youth were marginalized and took to the streets in protest, in solidarity with Mohamed Bouazizi. Indeed, there were many other cases of self-immolation in Tunisia. Whilst I was in Tunisia, 2 days later, I was invited over there on some political thing, a bit like this. 2 days later, we saw the second occupation of the Kasbah. This was just after the formation of the transitional government that had been implemented after the first wave of the revolutionary process. The main slogan was, "Do not marginalise the youth." The youth, in their hundreds of thousands, had taken to the Kasbah, which is the main seat of the government, to say, this is the transitional government, where is our place on it? We are central to this process, we were central to the occupations, and we've been left out. During the time we were there and the occupation of the Kasbah, the chants quickly turned to freedom for Palestine, quickly making those links between what was going on and the imperialist nature of the world. At the same time, the news from Libya came through, and the crowds went absolutely wild. Again, chanting about Palestine, about Libya, about the connections that our governments, between our governments and what they're doing to us. And this is on the back of massive years of anti-imperialist, anti-war campaigning. And we saw these sorts of processes, the mass unemployment, the rises in vegetable prices, the lack of food, all of these things. We saw these things across the country, across the Middle East, and of course, revolutions began in many places. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist or a socialist to recognise that when the very basic and fundamental elements of our life are under attack, people will react. although it's not inevitable that people will come to a left-wing understanding, if you like, and that's what we're here to think about what we should be doing, what is to be done, in the words of Lenin. There's a couple of main points I'd like to get across here, really, is that, especially when talking about what we've been involved in Britain, that austerity has produced two characteristic forms of protest: street demonstrations and occupations and actions, direct actions against tax avoiders, the mobile phone companies, Starbucks and things like this. And then a series of one-day strikes both in Britain but also across Europe. And in Europe, the highest point of this was on November the 14th last year, when trade unions or unionists from across Europe all went on strike together. But we have to look beyond the economistic forms of protest to ways of transforming the economic demands to political demands. So, for example, demands about wages could get transformed into demands against the bosses, against the system. Another point is that, as I've already said, that there is always an imperial dimension to these struggles, most obviously in the Arab revolutions, but also currently in Turkey vis-à-vis Syria, and in Greece in relation to Germany. Another point is that war and its ideological justifications are always used to divide us. If you think that capitalism produces and requires competition, competition leads to wars and militarization, and the ruling class will always use those ideological justifications to do those things, racism and putting us against each other. So therefore, really, there can be no anti-austerity movement without an anti-imperialism element to it, without anti-imperialism. So just going back now to Britain and the protests that I was involved in the UK, in London myself, many years ago we had free education that was free at the point of access, that was paid for through taxation. And then in 1998 we had an Education Act introduced by the Labour government. Just pressed the wrong button. And fees were introduced to £1,000. Then in 2004, just a year after the Iraq War, fees were introduced to £3,000 when the government said they couldn't afford education. We said, you can afford war, so fund education, not war. And now we have fees of £9,000. That's a tripling of fees, preventing many working class people from going to university. And it's not just, I'm not just saying this, there are facts and figures to back this up. And since the fees have been tripled, many young people, or people in general, cannot get to university. So they tripled the fees, they took away what was called the EMA, Education Maintenance Allowance, which was basically pocket money for 16 to 18-year-olds to enable them to afford travel to go to school, to afford books, and so on. This was taken away as well. So it wasn't just the university students, but right across the boards. And like I said, the immediate connection was made by the students between the money spent on war and our MPs' expenses and nuclear and so on and so on. And we were involved in massive protests across the country, culminating on the day of the first big one, where the headquarters of the Tory party, the Conservative Party in Britain, got smashed up. The windows got smashed, and the government and the media and the right-wing bureaucrats and the business people blamed the students, when we as students said, what is a few smashed windows compared to smashing the entirety of our education system? In fact, there was a young 15-year-old that spoke on TV who said, I am from the slums of London. You are taking away our opportunities to go to school, to go to university. We can't get work, we can't get jobs, and then you're going to blame us for having to turn to crime in order to feed ourselves. This was in November 2010. 9 months later, we saw riots across Britain, political riots, riots of the unemployed and the oppressed people, young people in London, who, exactly as that young boy predicted 9 months earlier, unemployed, unable to go to university or school, an act of desperation. As part of all these demonstrations, we also did occupations, as you probably saw, and various actions. And what we did do is we gave confidence to the trade union movement. Trade union movement that had been pretty dormant, or had some action, some strikes and whatever, saw what the students were doing. And I received, as the president of the University of London, received literally thousands and thousands of messages, both Facebook and Twitter, but also handwritten letters, which is unusual these days, saying, well done to the students, you are absolutely inspiring, we should all get together now and fight the government on all of the different attacks that they're, all the different attacks. But many of the people that had been involved in the student fees issue, many of the people that had been involved in the occupations and the actions and the demonstrations had actually been involved a number of years earlier in the actions against the Iraq War. The first group of people to walk out or to take action over the Iraq War were 14 and 15-year-olds at school, where hundreds of thousands of them literally walked out of school, sparking and giving the confidence to millions of other people. As you've seen, John Rees was involved in organising the 2 million demonstration. It was the first ever demonstration that I'd been on, and the rest is history, so to speak. So they'd been involved in anti-imperialist actions over Iraq, over Afghanistan, over Palestine. When Israel attacked Gaza in 2009, students again took to the streets, but we also occupied our universities. There's about 30 or so universities that occupied. And these actions are then learnt and remembered and reenacted in future actions. We occupied over the fees. We then also occupied over the other austerity measures. We occupied train stations and, like I said, Starbucks and things like this. So you can see how whatever we do, whenever we do it, everything has an impact and everything changes our political consciousness. And these same people are now, involved in the anti-austerity movements. I mean, we saw the fabulous Occupy movement. Occupy Tahrir, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy St. Paul's, let's occupy everything in protest at a government. I mean, this was a temporary the Wall Street one was a temporary thing, as obviously most of the things we do are, but it had a massive impact at highlighting what the banks and the financialisation of our system is doing to us.